Good afternoon. My name is Max Latona, and I am the Executive Director for the Center for Ethics in Business and Governance at St. Anselm College. I am pleased to welcome all of you today to our program, When to Speak Out, 3 questions to answer before taking a public position on social issues. We have a very special guest today who will be properly introduced to you in a moment by my colleague, Dina. But before she does so, I'd like to just say a few words about our center, especially to those of you who are seeing us for the first time. So the Center for Ethics in Business and Governance was established at the college roughly 4 years ago now to help communities and organizations in the region address many of the pressing ethical issues that they face, and to do so through research, through education, and through collaboration. One of our main goals as a center is to encourage reflection, dialogue, and, as I said, collaboration on the many questions and challenges that we face. And we think that learning from those who have researched these topics, who've thought very deeply about them, can help us in our own deliberations. And we'll see that's the purpose of today's program. Today's program is part of a new series offered by the Ethics and Governance Forum and the Center for Ethics in Business and Governance, called Corporations for the Common Good. And the purpose of this series is to investigate whether and how businesses should respond to pressing social issues. Now, the Ethics and Governance Forum, which features prominent speakers offering insights about stewardship, governance, leadership, and business ethics, is funded by a $2 million endowment created by the New Hampshire Secretary of State's office and the Center for Public Responsibility and Corporate Citizenship. That grant was awarded to St. Anselm College in 2013, and it was also ultimately a result of a settlement between the New Hampshire Securities Bureau and Tyco International in 2002. To learn more about our ongoing programs or about the Corporations and the Common Good series, I encourage you to visit our website, anselm.edu/ethics. Also, I'd like to remind you, in accordance with New Hampshire state law, that we are recording this session. It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Dina Frutos-Benze. She is a professor of international business here at St. Anselm College and a wonderful colleague, and she will now properly introduce our speaker for today. Thank you. Dina?
Yeah, good afternoon. So as Max said, my name is Dina Frutos-Benze, and I am an associate professor of international business here at St. Anselm College. So welcome to today's webinar. It is my pleasure to welcome Paul Argenti, professor of corporate communication at Dartmouth. He has taught management, corporate responsibility, corporate communication, and healthcare management at the Harvard Business School, the Columbia Business School, and as a visiting professor in Japan, Finland, the Netherlands, and Singapore. Professor Argenti is also a Fulbright Scholar and a winner of the Pathfinder Award for the Institute for Public Relations for the excellence of his research over a long career. He currently serves as faculty director for Tax Leadership and Strategic Impact Program at Dartmouth. Professor Argenti is also the author of various books on corporate communication and numerous articles for academic publications and practitioner journals. Professor Argenti also appears frequently on radio, NPR and APM, and TV. Just last week, he appeared on CNN International to discuss business responses to issues such as the voter restrictions in Georgia and human rights violations in China. Finally, the Ethisphere Institute has also listed him as one of the most influential people in business ethics. He served on the advisory board to the president of the World Bank and the board of trustees for the Ethisphere Institute. He has also served on advisory boards to CEOs globally for a variety of multinational companies. So we are very pleased to have such a distinguished speaker. Now, before I turn it over to our speaker, let me give you some instructions about Q&A. You may submit questions at any point during or after the presentation, and we would like to ask you to use the Q&A chat box, the Q&A box, not the chat box, because with the chat box, we don't, the panelists don't get to see the questions. So please, during the presentation or after, please type your questions. We will be monitoring them. At the end of the presentation, we will try to answer as many of the questions as possibly we can. We have a large audience today, so we'll do our best to make sure that your questions are answered. Now that the housekeeping is done and out of the way, please join me in welcoming Professor Argenti.
So much, Tina. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today, and thank you to the center for asking me to come. I'm really excited to speak with you about a topic that I feel passionately about. I started working on this research about 2.5 years ago, and I got pretty deep into it, and two gentlemen from Harvard wrote an article that kind of knocked me out of the box for a while, and I decided to put it aside. And then I was asked to give a keynote address and to do some consulting work for a couple of companies back in 2018 on the topic. And I just got back into it right away and picked up where I'd left off. And then this past year, as a result of all that was going on, particularly in the spring with Black Lives Matter, I decided it was time to write something about it. So I wrote an article in Harvard Business Review on this topic, and that is the basis for a lot of our discussion today. And since then, I've spoken out about it several times. It turns out there are so many different issues that we could look at in this regard that it's kind of mind-boggling to think about how many different ways this has exploded over the last several months. And I think companies have watched this. Political and social movements have deeply affected their employees, their customers, their investors, and the communities in which they're operating. If we want to really track like when this starts to take off most aggressively, I think we'd have to go back to 2016 as President Trump came into power and issues started to come to the forefront. And corporations were basically on the line trying to figure out how they would respond to these various issues. And if you just think back since that time, it's been a number of issues from LGBTQ to most recently the AAPI issues. And in the last couple of weeks, as Dina said, in China, there's an issue involving corporations that are basically involved in tangentially with the Uyghur situation there, particularly Nike and H&M, who have protested actions by the Chinese government. And then even more recently here in the United States, the voting issues in Georgia and now Texas. So it goes on and on. The real question is, if constituencies, and particularly our employees, expect us to speak out, what's the best way for us to think about that topic? As we go into this, I'd love for you to think about these two questions. And maybe these can guide your questions that you put into that Q&A box a little bit later. But what ideas have you used in your organization so that we can expand our knowledge based on your own experience? And then any insights from past experiences speaking up or staying silent and what you learned from those, in addition to any questions you have of clarification and so forth about what I'm saying. So I think if we go back to sort of the root place that we have to think about this topic, it really stems from an understanding of our strategy. And I'm spending a lot of time right now working on material related to the notion of why we exist from the perspective of corporate purpose. What is the purpose of the corporation? We can think about why you exist from a variety of perspectives. From, this pen is made by Cross Pen. They exist to make pens, but it's also a gift company. But more importantly, is their purpose something more than just making gifts to make money? And if that purpose is bigger, how do we let employees know about that? Similarly, our value system guides a lot of our decision making. Now, having a firm grasp of your company's purpose, the why you exist, helps inform your approach to speaking up on challenging societal issues, as does the value system that guides your organization. If I had to think about one thing that stops companies from really getting this right, is that the strategy is not clear enough to people in leadership positions and those in the organization to understand what the limits are to what you can and cannot comment on. So in laying that foundation, I think we also have to think about identifying our key constituencies. And you'll see when I get to the framework that I created for this, why that's such an important question. Constituencies include our customers, our shareholders, our employees, board members, the local community, and so on, our suppliers. There are a number of them, and it differs by companies, but the big four are always the same: employees, customers, communities in which we operate, and shareholders. Your company should have a high-level sense of how those constituencies feel about a range of social issues, paying particular attention to the views of your most influential constituencies, your customers, shareholders, employees, because it's very possible that they don't necessarily agree on all things, and you need to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. I think that's an important consideration. We'll come back to that in a few moments. And think through in advance how to handle moments when the views of constituencies do not align. Your biggest shareholder doesn't agree with your employees who are asking you to do something, and how are you going to make that complicated decision? If this hasn't happened to you yet, it will. And it's unfortunately the result of asking corporations to be more responsible and to be agents of change, and societal change in particular, that allows us to have to think about these things. If we went back to the 1970s and we were living in a world in which Milton Friedman said the purpose of a corporation is to make money, we wouldn't have to think about things like this. Now, what should a company do? Well, I ask myself the question, when should you speak out? That's the real question. And one of the basic beliefs that I had going into this research was that if corporations thought about it ahead of time, they wouldn't be thinking about it when something really, really big is happening or something awful is happening to them in particular. How should you prepare and position your response? Should your company take the lead in driving the conversation, or is it better to partner with other organizations to have a more meaningful influence on the issue? Or perhaps, and I think this is the most interesting question of all, should you avoid speaking out at all? Now, this is a really controversial topic because some people say it's such an important issue and it's an issue of morality and you have to speak out. No, you don't. There's no law that says the company has to speak out on any issue. And who gets to decide, as Milton Friedman once called it, who are the angels in society that get to decide what those issues are that we must speak out on? It's a very, very important question. According to a January 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer, 86% globally believe that CEOs should speak publicly on societal issues. And I think this is on challenges. This is a very, very important thing for us to understand, but it's impossible. In fact, I would say it's impractical, however, for companies to speak out in a way that is truly genuine on every issue. It doesn't make any sense. And thus the question for companies and C-level executives, given those finite executives, is when should you speak out? I kind of looked at this in the same way that I think Porter and Kramer looked at the way they think about corporate responsibility, if you're familiar with their model. And Mark Kramer and Michael Porter basically talked about, is it integral to your business? Is it something that is central to your overall strategy for your business? That would determine where our responsibility begins and ends. You can't give money or give time or give your talent to everyone. And in the same way, we can't speak out on every single issue. So I came up with these three questions to guide your approach. The first question is this: does the issue align with your company's strategy? There was a McKinsey article that came out right around the time that I was writing this that said what's needed is relatively clear. It's deep reflection on your corporate identity, what you stand for, which may well lead to material changes in your strategy and even your governance. Purpose is the most effective when it connects with a company's superpower, its unique ability to create value and drive progress. There have been a lot of different ways this is being expressed. I'm working on a project right now to help define corporate purpose and set a group of standards in place. And that will be announced in just a few weeks. And I think it's a really important matter for all of us to consider. Second, can you meaningfully influence the issue? This includes having the relevance, the expertise and the exposure to these topics, the resources, the willingness, however we want to describe it. But what you have to avoid is just being perceived as hypocritical or as woke washing. This has happened recently in Georgia, where companies are just jumping on. If they were so concerned about it, people say about Coke and Delta, why weren't they involved in trying to influence the legislation in the first place? If the company is not genuinely invested in the issue, they're better off supporting someone else's fight with donations or a whole host of other things that you have in your arsenal. And then the last piece is, will your constituencies agree with speaking out? I think obviously the company greatly reduces its risk of disrupting business if people agree, but that's not always the case. And I think what is the biggest issue is that they're often in very big disagreement about whether you should speak out or not. In addition, you have to think about, is there a moral case for response rather than just the business case? Well, again, which issues bubble up to the morality level and which issues are just, everyday issues that are going on that your employees in particular and your customers are pressing you to speak out about. So this was the original framework. If you read the Harvard Business Review article, you'll see the framework was adjusted so that the reason was it's so it could fit on a telephone, believe it or not. But I like this framework. I think it's a little bit easier to see on a big screen. And you see the number of yeses across the top. Does it align with your strategy? Can you influence the issue? Will your stakeholders agree or not? Are the three questions that I just posed. If the answer is yes to all three, speak out as a leader about the issue. And I'm going to talk about Starbucks speaking out on systemic racism as compared to Starbucks program where they asked baristas to have a conversation with you about racism, which did not fall into this category. Maybe you speak out as a follower if you are you have two yeses and one no, and you'll notice there's like a ladder here lining up for how to think about this, and you might want to conduct research, understand the risk, consider the authenticity behind speaking up. If your stakeholders don't agree, Amazon lobbying for an increase in minimum wage. Find a partner to increase the influence on the alignment. You can't influence it, but you avoid being perceived as disingenuous. Este Lauder partnered to speak out on AAPI hate crimes recently. It's a big issue. And then the one I just described with Delta, taking a stand against the new voting law. They have to have a game plan when not everyone is happy about it, and I'm not sure they did. Don't speak out for now, but continue to monitor Ford and climate change. Obviously, they are like General Motors came out and said they were going to be going to electric, I think within the next 10 years or so. Ford needed to respond, but we still don't know exactly what they're going to do. So they need to monitor that. And then if the answer to all three is yes, why are you speaking out? Why are you putting your neck out there? And what really can you do about it? So let's take a deep dive into the framework and let's review some recent events based on what I thought were 4 factors that would make it easy for us to talk about these. One is known recognizable brands. I didn't pick these because they were the best examples I have, but ones that I think all of us could relate to. 2, rich with documentation and nuance. So there's really not any question about what the issue is. You can find more about it if you so choose. 3, recent and relevant examples. So things that are going on right now. When I wrote the article, I was talking about a whole set of issues that are different from the ones that are going on now. I've tried to update it for today's presentation. And then finally, large scope and complex scenarios to help you to understand how to navigate this complicated terrain. So that's the way we will look at the example. So here's example number 1, 3 yeses, Starbucks and racism. And I don't know how much you know about this example, but I think it's a very, very rich example. I have written a case about Starbucks and its battle over fair trade coffee. I've kept in touch with the company. I had someone in my class just last week from Starbucks talking about their procurement processes. It's a company that spends a lot of time on responsibility, but 2 men were arrested in a Philadelphia Starbucks for basically doing absolutely nothing. Starbucks CEO meets with 2 Black men arrested in the Philadelphia store immediately. They decided to close 8,000 stores for racial bias education just a little bit after that, after the arrest of the 2 Black men. So they responded very quickly. And if we look at it in the context of my framework, it kind of makes sense that they came to that decision. It aligns with their overall strategy. They have been focused on racial issues for a very long time. Howard Schultz is passionate about this. It's a meaningful influence that you can do something about it with this training that other people then went ahead and decided to use. And obviously, most of your stakeholders are going to agree that you ought to let people use the bathroom. And I think the more important thing is those of us who use Starbucks for bathroom stops in urban areas know We all want access to bathrooms, so why shouldn't we have that access? And now we do because of this particular incident. You know, multiple deaths of Black men, mass protests swept the country with calls to fight systemic racism. They issued a statement from President Dr. Betsy Nabel, held a vigil in honor of George Floyd, and they kept going with this. 2 yeses, Este Lauder and AAPI hate crimes more recently. So this is one that is a little bit more recent. Anti-Asian sentiment hate crimes have risen tremendously. New York City alone reported a 1,900% increase in these crimes motivated by anti-Asian sentiment. And Stop AAPI Hate, a reporting database created at the beginning of the pandemic in response to this racial violence, has tracked nearly 4,000 incidents. And I wanted to get these numbers right because I think it's a huge issue. In the wake of the horrific mass shooting in Atlanta, Este Lauder spoke out against such rising hate, making multiple statements, including a commitment to $450,000. Speak Out framework, yes, aligns with their strategy. Stakeholders agree. National attention was drawn to rising AAPI hate crimes. They issued a statement from brand leader, followed with action, made a $450,000 donation, announced partnerships with nonprofits better positioned to tackle the nuances of the challenge. So, the no part, a beauty company isn't particularly well positioned to tackle racism, you might say, but their statement reflects this understanding by partnering with nonprofits that are better positioned to do so. So I hope this gives you an understanding of like how you sort these things out. And in some sense, this is one where they could have come down either way on this one, but they decided to come down on this side of the argument. Amazon, 2 yeses, Amazon and the federal minimum wage. And again, Amazon is a really interesting company for us to look at. They began vocally pushing for an increase in the federal minimum wage since 2018. And the reason was to position themselves better against competitors such as Walmart. In early 2021, they began a series of ads highlighting how they already were paying employees a minimum of $15 an hour, seeking to position themselves as an advocate. The issue with Amazon speaking up, however, is that the apparent hypocrisy they demonstrate by pushing for an increase while they missed the mistreatment of workers during COVID, particularly pertaining to worker safety, is going on. So, aligns with their strategy. They can influence the issue, but, President Biden seeks to link raising the federal minimum wage with COVID relief package. Amazon's been pushing for the increase for years. Mixed to negative reviews in light of Amazon's handling of worker safety during COVID. Why Amazon is flooding the country with $15 minimum wage ads, hypocrisy. The reality is that Amazon workers are still struggling. The company is actually pushing wages down in the warehouse sector while convincing people who might otherwise work retail to take on backbreaking labor. Now, this is really interesting because it's a twist on Walmart used to be the bad guy here. And I always say to my students, if you want to know who sells something, it basically boils down to 2 companies. It's either Amazon or Walmart are the largest providers of almost every product that exists today, certainly in the United States. So this is a really critical issue for them to think through. This is a more recent issue, and I think in March of this year, Georgia passed the divisive new voting law that President Biden called Jim Crow in the 21st century. Governor Brian Kemp, who's a Republican, insisted expanded access. The law functions as both. It expanded access in rural areas, but restricted access in more urban settings through new identification requirements and decreases in ballot drop boxes, the latter changes of which are more likely to disproportionately impact voters of color. Initially, as I said before, Georgia's largest employer, Delta, tried to remain silent, and I think that didn't get them very far. However, after a powerful group of Black executives, as well as a multitude of civil rights groups, called on big companies to oppose the legislation, Delta's CEO issued a company-wide memo criticizing the bill. They quickly faced criticism, and I have to tell you, I was on CNN, I guess it was on Sunday, talking about this. I got criticized for just speaking about it myself. So you face a tremendous amount of backlash on these issues when you stick your neck out and say something, because a lot of people said, you don't really understand the law, you don't know what you're talking about, why didn't Delta get involved earlier? Does it align with their strategy? Not really, unless we consider voting rights something that has something to do with airplanes. I'm not sure it does. Can they influence it? Yeah. Do their stakeholders agree? Most people agree that you should have access to voting rights. although it seems like this is a 50-50 argument, it's not even close. I mean, maybe in Georgia, it's a little bit different, but certainly if we look nationally, this is not an issue that people disagree on. But how does an airline address restrictive voting laws given deep divisions on the part of its major constituencies and strategic distance from the issue? Now they are facing a potential boycott from conservatives. They are facing backlash because of what I said before, they didn't get involved earlier. And this just gives us an understanding of how we think about it. So, I need to make it crystal clear that the final bill is unacceptable and does not match Delta's values, but corporations will face serious consequences if they become a vehicle for far left mobs. There's been a lot of interesting conversation about the Republicans caring more about the mobs that are creating this backlash against the Georgia voting law than the mobs who actually, physical mobs, who came out and violated the Capitol. And we also hear criticism of Mitch McConnell saying that he wants people to give money to corporations to give money to politics, but not really say anything. So people are talking out of both sides of their mouth on both sides of the aisle here. There's another consideration that I want to present to you, and that's this notion of climbing the ladder, which I think is a really interesting idea. And it goes back to my framework. If you think about no, three no's or no yeses, one no and two yeses, and that you kind of slowly climb up that ladder and work your way up. For some reason, this was left out of my article, but I think it's a really interesting concept for us to consider. And I think Ford is a really interesting company for us to look at. Because the situation is the auto industry generally has been relatively antagonistic when it comes to issues of climate change. I just finished a chapter on climate change communication, and most companies were antagonistic if you go back far enough. And today it's pretty hard to be antagonistic about something that affects all of our lives. Ford was among the most heavily involved in lobbying against the Clean Air Act in the 70s. Broadly adopted an approach in which they utilized backdoor channels and quiet lobbying to push legislation in their favor against any kind of climate change legislation. Moreover, the auto industry and transportation more generally is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. We know that. In the United States, emissions from transportation accounts for about, and this number will surprise you, 28% of total greenhouse gas emissions, making it the largest contributor of US GHG emissions. So again, they have a stake in this, obviously, and need to think about it. Doesn't align with their strategy at all. Can't meaningfully influence the issue. Their stakeholders are not going to agree with it. Historically opposed to any regulation, as I just said. No public statements in support of changes to ameliorate climate change. In fact, quietly endorsed opposition to any climate regulation. Ford announces a new carbon neutral target, and the car maker announced its plan to go carbon neutral in June of 2020. And I think this is a really interesting thing. What changed? Well, this change came about as an industry leader. That's one of the biggest contributors. Silence and inaction were no longer options. I know that Bill Ford personally cares about these issues. His family name is on the company. When you have a family involved, it can be very important for them to say something about it. And with increased regulation on the horizon, I think Ford took the position that action taken on their own terms was likely to be in their best interest. And I talk about this a lot, both in my research and in class. Get out ahead of regulation, get out ahead of the problem before it happens, create an opportunity platform for yourself by solving problems before they happen. I think, by the way, the same is true of crisis. If you solve problems before they happen, you never to get into trouble. And the same thing is true here. Speaking out also helped to better position them compared to competitors. They announced their decision to go carbon neutral by 2050, 2 climate targets in alignment with the Paris Climate Accords. And the public response was, they were tentatively supportive, investigating the extent to which the announcement was a PR stunt. This is a big problem for companies because a lot of communications about responsibility is still done through communication channels in the public relations corporate communications department, rather than a truly responsible act. It's basically a way for companies to try to position themselves. or indicative of their ability to lead real change. Not at all. Parts of the plan endorsed by UN-backed group, the Science-Based Target Initiative, which helps. So again, this is a really interesting issue for us to continue to follow, particularly given what GM has decided to do after this event. I think we've already done this one. So group conversation now for us to reflect on your organization's approach. And I'd love to open it up for us to talk about what ideas you have used in your organization before I wrap this up. And then second, any insights from past experiences you might have about speaking up or staying silent. So I'm going to go back to you at St. Anselm to give me some questions to think about and respond to, while I hope people who are attending the presentation will answer my questions. So back to you guys for a few minutes.
All right, let's see. So we have questions coming in, maybe not yet about your specific question.
Okay,
here, but
we'll wait for those, but give me the other questions.
We have one here, and that is sort of about the dangers of speaking out too much and on too many issues. So the framework is useful, but so when do you know, or how would you know when it's too much?
Well, I mean, I think the framework helps you from doing too much, right? And the problem is, I think we all recognize that the workforce is where a lot of the pressure is coming from today, right? I mean, that's where we see the biggest challenges for companies. If we look, starting with millennials on down, they want you to speak up about everything. So you're going to get pressure. And I think, Dina, the answer here is the more you have a framework that you're applying and the more you can explain that to people. This is how we think about this. We think about it in terms of our strategy. We think about it in terms of whether we're just jumping on the bandwagon to be, kind of woke washing is the way we would describe that, and how people will respond. Even if employees don't agree, they understand your logic. Saying nothing, and this is a really important point that I didn't make in the presentation that I want to say now. Saying nothing is not, neutral. I mean, that means you're doing something, and doing nothing is doing something pretty profound in this regard. So you can't do nothing anymore. You wish you could. You wish you could hide under a rock and go back to 1970 and listen to Milton Friedman, but you can't. So then applying what the framework allows us to do is to think about how we localize this to our company and try to apply some principles to come up with a response. That should limit the number of things you respond to. I mean, the bigger problem is if you speak out on every single issue, you really are diluting the effect of your ability to create change. And I think this is true. You think about it more on a personal level. If you give money to organizations every year, and let's say you have $500 that you want to give away every year, you have to think about where you can't give it to everyone. And there are needy organizations here in New Hampshire, in the United States, related to causes that you're passionate about. Elsewhere in the world, related to the pandemic, whatever it is. And you have to really think carefully. You can't give that money everywhere. So how do I make that decision? I make that decision on the ability for me to actually make a meaningful contribution that will matter to something that I feel personally passionate about, and that, my wife and I agree is where we want to put our money. It's the same kind of thing. Like, you cannot possibly use the tools, that limited number of quivers that you have in your arrow toolkit, and just shoot on every single issue. It just is not possible. And not only that, you will be accused of woke washing. And I think if we go back to one of the examples that I looked at, it might be helpful for this person to understand what I mean. So Starbucks has been interested in racism for a very long time. And before this issue in Philadelphia, many of you may remember they came out with a program called Race Together, #RaceTogether. And the idea was you'd go into a Starbucks and the barista was going to write on a cup, #RaceTogether, and you and the barista would get into a meaningful conversation about race. Well, talk about a cockamamie idea. And obviously no one had said no to Howard Schultz in a very long time when he came up with that crazy idea. And it really went wrong. Like the company was just viciously attacked. Now, the concern about race was a legitimate one, but the execution of it was really bad, and the timing of it was really bad. And, we discovered that people were saying, I don't have enough time in the time it takes to whip up a frappuccino to talk about 400 years of oppression. And we found out that most of the board members at Starbucks are white, that in the advertisements announcing this program, there were all white hands handling it. It was just a complete disaster. That same corporation finds itself in a situation involving race just a couple of years later, and you can see that they can actually jump in and do something, kind of climbing the ladder, as I described it earlier. So, jump in when you really have something to say and you have something that you can actually do, rather than trying to jump in on every single issue would be my answer.
Right. And so thank you. Yes, I think that in a way relates to another question we have in terms of, how accountability for businesses has changed. And you mentioned right now, like, it's not the 70s, right? So should corporations kind of now have the same ethical responsibilities in a way as the average citizen? And how much, maybe, I guess this is a two-way question, how much power really consumers or even employers have? I mean, we always hear about that, right? That the companies are very concerned about that, but how real is that, I guess, is the question.
How powerful, I'm sorry, do I understand the question? How powerful say that again, are the consumers?
How much power consumers and employers really have
employees,
over sort of
you mean employees?
I'm sorry,
employees,
employees, yes.
Well, that's a really good question. And I think it kind of depends on how the corporation looks at it, right? So if we go back, and just a quick lesson here from a history standpoint, which I think most of you in the center would understand. If we go back to the 70s, why was it that Milton Friedman was able to say with a straight face, the purpose of a corporation is to make money? Because we had a functioning government that actually did stuff to help society in a way that we don't have today. We have a dysfunctional government. And we also, back in the 80s, all agreed, not all of us, but many people agreed with Reagan and Thatcher that business can solve your problems. I think what most business people did not realize is that people would take them seriously and understand that businesses can do a better job. And then the expectations for business went through the roof. So now we have these expectations that are ridiculous for companies to follow, and employees in particular, but customers as well. I always like to say about customers, though, they talk thin and eat fat is the way I describe it. They'll have a Diet Coke with their Big Mac, metaphorically speaking. And what that means is that they say they won't buy products from companies and they won't do this and they won't do that. And then they'll go on a cruise, which is, one of the worst industries from a responsibility standpoint. Or they'll recycle, but they won't care about the seafood industry, which is incredibly disruptive and under attack. So I think that this is part of the problem, is that the expectations for corporations on the part of employees and customers and communities and all kinds of constituencies are through the roof. And the real question is, how much will you let that influence what you do? Well, again, you are not in business exclusively to make the world a better place. I mean, your number one priority, your number one responsibility is to make enough money to keep the company afloat, right? So there's nothing more responsible than making enough money so that the company survives. We know that. But then we start to move on and think about, okay, how do I think about the other constituencies in my corporate life? And I have to make trade-offs. And I was thinking about this before when we were looking at that question, and I wrote some notes, and I don't even know that I actually said this, but I think it's important. Let's say under the constituency banner, for instance, that I'm thinking about one constituency that's influencing the equation more than another. So these constituencies disagree with each other, but you have to discuss and weigh the relative importance to the business. So a small customer segment is influencing you in one way with limited power versus your largest investor. I mean, do you really have a choice in that discussion? All right, now let's change the nature of that decision. it's about an issue of morality, as the organization has decided this is a moral issue. Now, who gets to decide what moral issues are and what aren't? It's an interesting question. Is Black Lives Matter a moral issue, but the Georgia vote is not? Is LGBTQ a moral issue, but the issues going on in China are not? With the Uyghurs, like, we don't care about Uyghurs, but we care about, so it goes on and on and on. I think that's where you really start to get into problems unless you know who you are. And I want to go back to that individual example that I gave before, Dina, because on an individual level, what I care about most, I give my money to, right? I do. And it matters a lot to me. So that when I'm involved in something that I feel passionately about, I want to help that cause. And given that I have a limited amount of resources, that's where I'm going to put my time and money, rather than giving to the United Way. And I have nothing against the United Way, but that's like scattershot philanthropy. It's not strategic philanthropy. The way we think about responsibility today is much more strategic overall. And I think speaking up is another strategic angle on the same issue. So the answer that I would have to my consumers is, do you really want us to speak up about something that we're really not doing anything about? We would like to spend some time not just studying the issue, but trying to actually do something about it before we say something. Or the same thing to our employees. We feel passionately about this, but we really can't do anything about it. I would love to have heard that conversation at Este Lauder. I wonder what that was like. Well, you can't really do anything about this, but we're going to speak out on it anyway, because we have a lot of Asian Americans working in our New York office, or whatever the decision-making is. There was a morality associated with it that seemed to be more profound. Like, we're not going to stand by and let this happen. But getting in at the right time, I think, the Delta and Co cases are really interesting. Like, why weren't they there to kind of influence the legislation? They could have had a tremendous impact behind the scenes to stop that legislation rather than waiting until later on. In fact, the initial word from the Delta CEO was that, hey, this came out better than we thought it would, which was not the right thing to say. Then he had to backtrack, walk back those comments, and do exactly what he did. So I think it's a really tricky one. And what happens, by the way, if your employees don't agree with your customers, which could be the case. So your employees think it's a really bad idea for you to do business in China because, the issue in China is this region of China, Xinjiang, is where, all the cotton is from, and people are horribly mistreated there. There's an incredible story in the New Yorker this week about this, by the way, if you're interested. And yet your customers want access to that material, and you have products, and they don't care about Uyghurs. Like, that's too far away from me. And I think this is an issue. We talk about this in my corporate responsibility class all the time. Even growing up as an Italian American in Providence, Rhode Island, our family came first. Like, we cared about our family. Everything outside of that, we call them stranger, stranieri. It's like the Japanese, they have gaijin, the word for that. So we all think about things in that way. Like, what's close to home? What can I influence? What role do I play in this? How do I make trade-offs among those constituencies? Really hard questions. And it's not a simple equation. I wish that my formula would work in every single case and you could just apply it and move on. I think it's a good way to start the conversation, but maybe not where the conversation ends.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there is a question a little bit more about China, but let me go now to another question. It's shifting a little bit from the line we're going right now, but it is about Biden's proposal to raise the corporate tax rate, which is aligned with your framework. I mean, the person asking says it seems aligned with your framework, but there appears to be a deafening silence early on with this topic. And so the suspicion is that the pressure may outweigh social gain or loss. And they want to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, I think, wow, what a great question, because I think that's how the Republicans could easily win in this battle, right? They're saying, oh, you want to pay more taxes. And that's been exactly what I think Mitch McConnell has said. And Georgia as well has said the same thing to Delta as well. I think it's really interesting. If you look at who would we consider is both one of the most successful business owner, managers, leaders in the world, and also one of the most responsible who has spoken out about this, both personally and in terms of his organization. It's Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett says, I should be paying more taxes, and I think if more leaders said, if we want an infrastructure that allows our bridges not to cave in, and we want an infrastructure that allows the bottom rung of society to pull themselves up in the way that previous generations did during the Depression and so forth, somebody's got to pay for that. It's not a free pass. Like we owe it to society to do something. So I always say the first corporation that jumps on this one is going to be seen in a really, really different light from those that end up following and are the 20th corporation to sign on. By the way, it's a really interesting thing, and I don't want to lose this thought, because I was looking at some of the issues related to, I think it was related to pipeline in Alaska or in the Arctic, and how a bunch of banks said they weren't going to support financing of any projects there when Trump came out with that. One bank did not. It was Bank of America. It turns out Bank of America has never supported any projects there, so they didn't say anything. Guess what? They were maligned and attacked. And that's the way this is going to play out. Like a handful of companies will start saying, yeah, we think it's a good idea because we believe in this program. And then others will follow, and the ones that don't say anything are going to be pariahs. And they haven't done anything. It's not like they're doing anything negative. It's just not speaking out becomes an issue in itself. So this is a tricky one because, nobody wants to pay more taxes. But Warren Buffett also says, I would love to pay more taxes. Charge me more. I'm a multi-billionaire. How much do I need to make? Charge more. And I always say to my students, he seems to be a pretty smart guy and a pretty successful businessman. It's not like he's a loser. So maybe we should learn something from him on this matter, right?
Yeah. Kyle, yes.
So, Professor Argenti, as you're describing this model, you said multiple times this is difficult. It's hard for corporations to make these decisions. And a lot of the examples you've given have been from these large corporations who have a lot of people and sometimes even ethics officers who can help make these decisions. What would be some of your suggestions for smaller companies, right? Like a lot of the companies we have in our state that might not have a whole lot of spare employees or spare time to think through these issues.
Yeah.
Care about where they live, they care about their communities. How does this model how would this help these smaller companies?
Yeah, obviously the article that I wrote was, for a multinational kind of approach. I don't think it's any different at all. I don't think there's any difference. I think the issues are different. And certainly there are different ways to think about it, probably at the local level. But there are issues here in New Hampshire that people should and could talk about that would influence the governor to do things in a different way, or the legislature to look at the world in a different way. And jumping into that, we'll have the same challenges that we have for everything else, right? But, should they respond to issues related to, say, AAPI issues like Asian hate, was that an issue here in the state for the company? Is it something that they personally were involved in? If it was, then yeah, they probably should, right? So again, it's kind of that localized approach that allows you to speak out about it. We don't live in Georgia or Texas, and hopefully New Hampshire will not come up with some crazy restrictions on how we can vote any more than they already have restrictions. And we won't have to ever deal with that. But if we did, and corporations felt strongly about it, and small companies, have an influence in this state, right? And defining small, by the way, $100 million company is a small company in the greater scope of things. But in this state, a company, with 10 employees can say something and be a big voice if that voice ends up being responsible for swaying public opinion or getting legislators to see things differently. Honestly, I think one of the mistakes that we make is that because we're small, even as individuals, that we don't really have a voice. Like, well, there's not much I can do about it. I think about this every day, like, well, should I really care about recycling? I have to they've taken away glass recycling here in Hanover, New Hampshire. I now have to drag all my glass up to the dump, and is that something I should really care? Well, if I don't do that, what's happening. And you're like, well, does it really matter? That's all going into the same dump. But even those small things that we do, reusing plastic, not using plastic at all, understanding what kind of seafood we're buying that is sustainably caught versus not, supporting businesses that seem to be on the right side of issues. Those small things add up. And I think that's what a democracy is all about, that we make those small decisions as individuals and as corporations, and that leads to systemic change. And I think, I don't think there's any organization that is too small to make a big difference. And certainly here in New Hampshire, businesses should all think about this as much as a multinational does.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I guess we can connect this maybe a little bit. You mentioned China a little bit earlier, and we have a question related in a way to the responsibility, right? How much influence can one have depending on where you live? And specifically with China, right? I mean, because we know that we buy a lot of things from China, right? A lot of businesses are there. So how much can a business that really is invested in China and has manufacturing there and their business depends on the supply chain in China can have an influence on, let's say, their human rights or the Uyghurs, for example, the cotton?
It's a great question. I did a spot on CNN International on this on, I think, Thursday. And what I said then, and I think this is really true, is that corporations have more control than they think. Like everybody thinks, well, China said it, so we don't do anything. And that's like a bully, right? We don't agree with that. And I pointed out the example of the NBA. When the NBA basically backed the general manager from the Houston Rockets and said, we're not going to put up with this stuff from China. The NBA didn't get kicked out of China. And I think, take a look at Nike. 25% of Nike's business is in China. Nike is one of the lead sponsors for the Beijing Olympics, and whenever that is, 2022. I think it's the Winter Olympics or 2024. I forget which one it is. But Nike is one of the lead sponsors. They have a tremendous amount of power, and they ought to use that leverage to do something, right? H&M, which is the other company that has been spoken about, what the Chinese government did to them was take away, only the Chinese government could do this, they took away the GPS so that you couldn't find their stores anymore on GPS in China, which is kind of like who would think of even doing that, right? But they felt really strongly about it because their clothing and how they're looked at, and I think they're a Swedish company, if I'm not mistaken, how they're looked at in their home country is more important to them than how they're looked down in China. And at some point, I think companies need to decide, do you really want to do business in China given the way it is? And I wrote a case about this many years ago about Google in China. It was in my textbook for a couple of editions. And it was about, one of the things that they said it was do no evil was like their value system. But going into China, the Chinese government said you can do business here as long as you censor yourself and make sure that no one in China is exposed to things they shouldn't be exposed to. And we'll tell you when you cross the line. Google agreed to do that. Like, why would you ever agree to do that? And then, by the way, in the meantime, the Chinese government supported Baidu and, Google was pushed out of the country. Was there anything smart about what Google did in that case to do business in China? So in one case, you have zero influence and you don't need to get involved. In the other case, you have a tremendous amount of influence and you can maybe change the nature of how these countries think about it. I think, by the way, the Uyghur issue is big, not just there, it's in Myanmar. And as I took a group of students to Myanmar the year before that issue blew up, and the country was ready to explode onto the international scene. McKinsey was opening up an office. All that got scaled back. Was it really worth it to oppress the Uyghurs to do that? And I think the Chinese are very astute business people. They will understand the effects of those decisions and what it means for them, I think. So.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and then
great. And then I'll put my presentation back up and summarize.
Okay. Oh, wait. So I think then, do you think we have time? Yes. All right.
Yeah, we have time. We have time.
All right. Okay. Go ahead.
Yes. So we have a few of our college leaders on this participating here. So I'm going to ask how this applies to colleges. Because colleges are in a unique space. They're not for-profit corporations, of course. And they also have this historic role as a place of free inquiry, right? Where there's lots of different ideas in dialogue with each other. So what do you think colleges should do about it? How much?
Yeah, I think, by the way, I think this is a great question. And I know here at Dartmouth and at the Tuck School in particular, for all of the issues that we've talked about, whether it's LGBTQ or the more recent AAPI issue, not the voting issue, but both the president and our dean have come out very strongly. And because we have students, right, who are deeply affected by this. And I think that's what you can do. I think the more interesting question here, and I wrote an article about this that'll be coming out in the next month or two, like what is the responsibility of organizations during the pandemic? I think universities really need to think about the behavior that they have at a time like this in a way a little bit differently from normal times, and understand that everybody's looking at you right now and your behavior is going to be judged like history is judging you. And it's no different whether we're looking at the pandemic or we're looking at if something went on in New Hampshire, whether a university would respond to that or not. And it probably makes sense to apply the same set of principles. Like, is this something that we believe in? Well, we believe in free speech. I mean, it's a main tenet of what we do, right? That's why we run schools the way we do and have tenure systems and all of that. And we have to act exactly the same way. Most of these institutions are corporations in themselves, right? I mean, Dartmouth is a huge organization that has a role to play in society. So I don't know that it's any different, but I do think that I think generally colleges and universities sort of believe that if they just hide under a rock, it'll go away. And I think that's a mistake. I think the more outspoken that you are early on, probably the better off you're going to be as history judges you. So it's kind of where I would come out on that one. So with that in mind, let me go back and see if I can get my presentation back up there again. And I just have a couple more slides that I want to share with you guys very quickly, and then we'll end our presentation today. So we didn't get a whole lot of these ideas, but I hope people are collecting them and thinking about them. It's much easier to do when we get into a live audience than online, I know. But here are some takeaways. And I think it's really important to understand these. Just to remember, does it really align with your strategy? And again, whether it's a college or university or a corporation, big business, small business, can you do something about it? Because if you can actually do something about it in your community, why aren't you speaking out about it? Will your stakeholders agree? Which stakeholders agree? Which ones disagree? And I think it equips teams with a framework that will help them to determine when to speak out. It won't be haphazard. And it also offers a business case for how to speak out. And finally, it enables companies to determine which issues are the most relevant to their business to both make a positive impact in society and their bottom line. So again, when we think about organizations that don't have a actual bottom line, but they have a bottom line too. I mean, universities have a bottom line that may not mean making money. They need to make enough money to be able to do their business. But we all have something that we're striving for. And I think the framework kind of applies universally across those themes. I want to end with this quote from Plato. Wise, he said men, but we'll say people, speak because they have something to say. Fools, because they have to say something. Don't be the fool who feels like you have to say something. Be the wise person who speaks out because you have something actually to say. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's been a pleasure. Feel free to email me with questions, paul.argenti@dartmouth.edu. And thank you, St. Anselm, for hosting me today. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for a very enlightening talk and a lively discussion, even within this virtual world. I think we managed to get a lot of the questions. So thank you very much. We appreciate your time, and I thank everyone in the audience for participating.
Bye-bye, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.